All right. I know attendees are still filing in, but I'm going to get started because I know we're running a little bit late. So thank you again to everyone joining us, most notably our sponsors, our panelists, our host, our moderator, and then all of you that are joining as attendees. We're really excited for the conversation today. So my name's Emily Broad-Lieb, and I'm the director of the Food Law and Policy Clinic at Harvard Law School. And today, this webinar is part of a series that's co-hosted between my organization, the Global Food Banking Network, and Food Systems for the Future. And I'm going to give a little bit of background and then introduce our moderator, Earthren Cousin, who is director of Food System for the Future. So on the next slide, you can see an image from the Global Food Donation Policy Atlas Project. And I know many of you are here because you know of the project, but I thought I would start with a little bit of background. So this project is a collaboration between the Food Law and Policy Clinic and Global Food Banking Network that was started, we're now almost 5 years in, and is a collaboration that was really inspired by the paradox of enormous rates of food loss and waste at the same time that we have rising rates of global hunger. So about a third of the world's food supply is lost or wasted every year at the same time that more than 800 million people face hunger. And of course, not all of this food is safe and edible, but much of it is and is wasted for a variety of different reasons that are, surpluses, cosmetic, poor choices, poor planning. And yet what we found is that often policies make the donation of this food difficult because they're either confusing, they're unclear, they cause hidden costs, or they just lack incentives for businesses to make better decisions. So we launched the Atlas Project to help develop a better understanding of these laws and policies and share best practices. And support for the project comes from Walmart Foundation, Lineage Foundation for Good, the Hoffman Family Foundation. So the next slide, you can see a couple of the goals for today's webinar. This webinar is part of a series that we've run basically in short bursts over the past few years. And later I have a slide that will show some of the topics of prior webinars. But the goal of these all has been to really dig into one area of policy that has come up in our research on the Atlas Project as being a key opportunity for policy change to really align around food waste prevention and increase food recovery and donation. So the goals today are to really understand concerns, challenges, and ideas regarding implementation of national food waste strategies. That's the policy topic for today. We're going to learn from some best practices around the world, and we have some amazing speakers around using national strategies and really like planning at the across government and between the public and private sector to reduce food waste and encourage food redistribution. And then we'll talk about policy considerations. So in the next slide, you can see a little bit of the project goals of the Atlas kind of big picture. As I mentioned, one of our main goals has been to really identify and analyze the key laws that really are the most suited to reduce food waste and increase donation. We've now looked at these in 24 countries. We have a 25th country underway right now, which is Vietnam. And the Atlas website shares all of the findings from these countries. The next is to recommend policy change, and this is really identifying barriers from talking to different stakeholders in country and then learning about best practices so we can make those recommendations like we are today, talking about national food waste strategies. We try to provide global engagement on these topics through our website, which is interactive and has a map where you can check out a lot of these policies and best practices, and then and also using these webinars. And then lastly, we provide technical assistance to a number of countries. The next slide, I'm not going to go in detail, but this just shows from the research we've done in the original 5 pilot countries, we identified a list of the key laws that every stakeholder, whether in the food banking sector, other nonprofits, food businesses, and government, raised the same issues across countries. So these are the standard issues that we've looked at across all the countries where we've researched. And you can see on the right, food waste law and policy. And that category is really what covers these national food waste strategies that we'll talk about today. The next slide really shows of that category of a food waste framework, law, or policy. So you can see on the left side of this a map that is a screenshot from our website. And on the website, you can really click on any policy area, and different countries will light up based on whether they have a policy in that area or the strength of the policy. We didn't code separately for national food waste strategies. We put it under a bigger heading of whether a country has either a framework, food waste law, or a strategy. And those are the ones you can see in green here. And based on our initial research, we found that 8 of our 24 countries do have some sort of, food donation or food waste framework, law, or policy. And then of those, about 6 of these countries in the Atlas have a national food waste strategy, including Australia, which we'll hear about more today. 3 of them have a national food waste strategy in progress, including the US, which has a draft strategy that was published in December, and we'll hear more about that. And then a number of countries are using the process of developing nationally determined contributions as part of their requirement to reduce emissions under COP as a way to set goals that include food loss and waste reduction. And we'll also get to hear more about this during the discussion today. So a couple more things before I turn to our moderator. One more slide here shows just on our website, you can also, in addition to searching by country, you can search by policy area. And this is a screenshot. I know it's a little hard to see, but the icons on the left side, if you go to our website, you can explore each of these policy issues. And for many of them, we now have either a link to a webinar or a summary of the webinar that discuss best practices, as well as a policy issue brief. And in the blue, you can see the issue briefs that exist. And tomorrow we'll actually have 2 new issue briefs being published. One on national food waste strategies, which you're hearing about today, and then another on reporting on either emissions or food waste or environmental reporting and the policy opportunities to really use that to drive food waste reduction. So that webinar will be coming next month, and the issue brief will be out tomorrow. So lastly, on the next slide, it is my pleasure to really quickly give you a snapshot of the logistics and then introduce our amazing partner and moderator. So the session is really the opportunity to discuss best practices, challenges, and opportunities. We're going to first hear from our speakers. After I introduce our moderator, she'll introduce each of them. And then after they give a short presentation, Earthren has some questions for them, and then we'll have really opportunity for open floor discussion. So you can at any point use the Q&A or the chat function to ask questions, and then we will, Earthren will be able to ask those of our amazing panelists. So with that, I'm honored to introduce Earthren Cousin, who is the official moderator for our webinar series. And as I mentioned, her organization, Food Systems for the Future, is also an official partner of this series. So Earthren's the CEO and founder of Food Systems for the Future. She's very busy, as she, in addition to doing that, is a visiting scholar at the Center on Food Security and the Environment at Stanford University, and also a distinguished fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. She previously served as executive director of the World Food Program and as U.S. ambassador to the UN agencies for food and agriculture. And before that, she helped lead the U.S. domestic fight to end hunger as the executive vice president and chief operating officer of America's Second Harvest, which is today known as Feeding America. So without further ado, Earthren, I would love to have you join and introduce our speakers. Thank you so much again.
Well, good morning, Emily, and good morning to all of our participants and to the audience who joins us here today. And thank you very much for that generous introduction. Today, as we sit here in this webinar, 3.1 billion people lack access to affordable, nutritious food on a regular basis. While food loss and waste, as Emily noted, accounts for some 30% of all the food produced globally on an annual basis. Indeed, during my tenure as the WFP executive director, my team calculated that if we could capture all the food loss on the continent of Africa on an annual basis, it would exceed the food assistance distributed annually across the continent. Imagine the difference such a change would make in the number of those hungry, and malnourished. Scaling food recovery and donation is essential for human health as well as for planetary health. The FAO data confirms if annual food loss and waste were a continent, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter behind the US and China. So despite the growing recognition of the challenges food loss and waste pose, as well as the opportunity for addressing these challenges presented by scaling recovery and donation, only 21 countries to date include food loss and waste action in their national determined contribution plans or their NDC plans. Today's webinar will convene stakeholders from across the globe in a discussion regarding the importance of national strategies to including food loss and waste recovery, increasing action to scale food loss and waste recovery and donation, and the examples of the opportunity for forward movement. So I'm delighted that we are all together here today. And as Emily noted, we'll begin with short presentation remarks from each panelist, followed by a moderated discussion amongst the panelists. We will then open the floor for questions. Please type your questions into the chat box in either English or Spanish, and I will pose questions from the chat box. So let's begin. We have an impressive group of panelists from around the world for this meeting. Lana Suarez from the USA EPA, Pete Pearson from USA WWF, Sarah Pinnell from the Australia Food Bank, and Valentina Hupe Forlet from the Chile Ministry of Environment with recorded remarks. First, we'll begin with Valentina, who worked on Chile's National Organic Waste Strategy, which has served as the gold standard and an inspiration for many Latin American countries seeking to develop a similar strategy. Valentina, just as an introduction, received her degree in industrial civil engineering and a master's in environmental management and planning from the University of Chile. She has been a professional of the Circular Economy Office at the Ministry of Environment for 6 years and was involved from the design stage of the National Organic Waste Strategy. She is currently supporting her country's implementation of their waste strategy. Previously, she spent 6 years in the Office of Planning, Budget, and Management Control within the same ministry. Please, let's hear from Valentina now. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation. Sorry for my poor English. I will try to do my best. My name is Valentina Huepe, and I am a professional at the Circular Economy Office of the Ministry of Environment of Chile. And I was asked to present about my experience in the development of the National Organic Waste Strategy, or NRO, as we say in Spanish. First of all, I must highlight the participatory spirit of the strategy from its origin. For this purpose, formal and informal participation instances were defined in order to listen to key actors from the public sector, private sector, academia, and civil society, both at national and regional levels, presenting the diagnosis and identifying barriers and proposing solutions. Additionally, technical consultancy was hired to gather information as a basis for decision-making, and online surveys were conducted with key stakeholders and the general public. One of the results of this process was to confirm that there is no a single solution, as it depends on each territory. Therefore, the NRO promotes household, neighborhood, and large-scale solutions promoting prevention and on-site valorization. All of the above can be included in an early participation process, which was completed with observations received in a formal public consultation process, where observations from international experts from UNEP were also received, who kindly offered to translate the final instrument into English. I must say that this one was very relevant as the strategy did not have any budget associated with its implementation, but having this public policy instrument in English and Spanish allow for opportunities for technical assistance from international organizations, and public financing has been focusing towards organic waste valorization, considering that the private sector must organize and finance the management of inorganic waste through the Extended Producer Responsibility Law, or EPR law. Also, it was an instrument that does not have binding character like a law or regulation, the creation of modification of binding instrument was proposed. But given the learning from international experience, it was necessary to capture the main proposals of the UNRWA in a law. And for this reason, the bill that promotes the valorization of organic waste was submitted to Congress on August of 2023. The objective of this law is to reduce the amount of waste that is disposed of, incentivizing the reduction of its generation and promoting its valorization through different management of household organic waste and the reinforcing of planning and governance of waste management. For more information, I will leave the link to the bill here. And I emphasize that this law does not directly address the prevention and reduction of food waste, as there is currently another bill that regulates the distribution of food fit for human consumption in Congress, led by the Ministry of Health. I will leave the link to the bill also here. Meanwhile, we are in the middle of the implementation of the UNRWA, mainly supporting our key actors like local and subnational governments in different ways, addressing financing, governance, regulation, education, citizen involvement, prevention, among others. In conclusion, UNRWA has been very well received from the beginning in all sectors, including the general public, and a strong public-private partnership have been formed. There is consensus that we need to advance in this challenge, and public and private institutions have made progress in organic waste valorization, embracing the UNRWA. But we know it's not enough. So we hope for the prompt approval of the bill to create the enabling conditions that the country needs as the climate crisis demands. Thank you again for the invitation. I will leave my email in case you have any questions. Bye-bye.
Very much appreciate Valentina for submitting her video for your viewing today. And I would invite you all, as she noted in the video, to please look in the link to the waste strategy that is included in both English and Spanish that you can use for your reference as you pursue more details regarding the Chilean policy, as well as an example of what is possible. I will also want to underscore what Valentina noted in her video, the importance of public-private partnerships. I think as we have considerable anecdotal information that we're gathering from across the globe, the institution of public-private partnerships and public-private action in this space is quite critical to building both sustainable and resilient programs and facilities that serve a broader population. Now, let's move into our live presentation. Our next speaker is Lana Suarez. Lana is the Associate Manager in the Materials Management Branch and leads the sustainable management of food efforts under the Sustainable Materials Management Program at the Environmental Protection Agency. Lana joined the agency in 2004, and prior to her present position, she supported the federal agencies in meeting sustainability goals. She coordinated federal partnership with Urban Waters, as well as reviewing pesticides labels. She served as a Peace Corps volunteer in Nicaragua from 2000 to 2003. Lana attended the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment, and she received her academic training in environmental policy and behavior. Lana, over to you.
Thank you for that introduction. I am excited to be here and share a little bit more about the development of the draft National Strategy for Reducing Food Loss and Waste and Recycling Organics in the United States. Today, I'll share some background, a little on our goal and interagency collaboration, more on the strategy development itself, and provide some milestones that I think you all will be interested in, and then additional details on the draft strategy itself, and end with some resources that I think everyone will be interested in. So first, moving on to our goal. One of the drivers of the strategy development is the national goal to reduce food loss and waste by 50% by the year 2030. The United States had announced this goal in September of 2015 as the U.S. 2030 Food Loss and Waste Reduction Goal. We announced it jointly from the Department of Agriculture and the Environmental Protection Agency. In September of 2021, EPA updated the baseline to align the 2030 goal with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal Target 12.3. So we had a goal, and that's one of those drivers. And then moving on to our interagency collaboration, the strategy development was a joint effort of the federal interagency collaboration to reduce food loss and waste. These three agencies, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Agriculture, and the Food and Drug Administration, have a formal agreement which started in 2018 to affirm their shared commitment to reduce food loss and waste. The mission of the Environmental Protection Agency is to protect human health and the environment, and my office, the Office of Resource Conservation and Recovery, does that by promoting the conservation of resources and ensuring proper management of waste. USDA provides leadership on food, agriculture, and natural resources, and the Food and Drug Administration is responsible for protecting public health and the safety of our nation's food supply. So we all have a connection to food, certainly, and have been working together. So another driver of the goal announcement and the strategies development is the quantity of wasted food. We already heard a little bit about that. It's millions of tons of valuable resources being thrown away, and we can do better. But what I think you really are interested in is the high-level timeline. So moving on to that high-level timeline, I thought this audience would appreciate seeing some of the key milestones of the draft strategy development. Key takeaways is that this strategy development involved multiple agencies at a high level. The three agencies in 2019 released a federal interagency strategy to reduce food waste, prioritizing 6 action areas in which to coordinate efforts. This was a short document, only 2 pages, with interagency priorities identified. And then a side note for everyone is that there was an administration change starting in 2021. So that was also happening at the same time. Also during this time, we were receiving input from external partners, and I'll share some of those examples in a minute, but I also included the release of other EPA strategies related to the circular economy that were released during this time to show concurrent work that's happening. Most notably, EPA hosted a food and organics strategy and research stakeholder meeting in December of 2021. About 18 external organizations were represented. It was a 3-hour event where we discussed actions needed to prevent food waste and overcome barriers to organics recycling, as well as research needs. And in December of 2022, the Food Loss and Waste Interagency Policy Committee kicked off. This was a high-level group led by the Biden-Harris administration that pulled in several other government agencies and asked for food loss and waste efforts and to identify additional actions. And by December of 2023, we were able to release the draft strategy for public comment. So years in the making, a lot of work went into this, and I'll share some more detailed notes in a little bit. But moving to partner input. In addition to the partner meeting that we hosted, the agencies received input outside of that event from entities external to the federal government, non-governmental organizations, academia, states and local government groups. And this slide shows some of those examples, like the Zero Food Waste Coalition's call to action, some other reports, ReFed's roadmap to 2030, and some federal advisory committees, to name a few of that external input that we were receiving at the same time. And I wanted to briefly share a little more on the strategy series that EPA is building upon. So moving forward, to show that strategy series, again, to show that concurrent work taking place. I'm mentioning the other strategies in the next slide because organics are addressed in both. The National Recycling Strategy identifies actions to improve the U.S. recycling system. Food is a large part of our municipal solid waste, and improving the materials management infrastructure will also address wasted food and other organics management pathways. The plastic strategy calls out the need to develop composting systems and certified compostable materials. Much of food packaging is plastic, and that serves to protect the product and extend shelf life in many cases. So next, I want to share some additional details related to the food loss and waste strategy specifically. I shared high-level milestones earlier that spanned years, but you may be wondering how an internal draft turned into a draft for public comment. So once we had an internal draft document, we started circulating it at a higher level across all agencies. Each agency had its own review process and steps to follow. This started in early 2022. And then from May to September of that year, the draft went through several rounds of review. And there was a pause while the administration launched the Interagency Policy Committee. And then we picked up that effort again the following year. Once we picked it up, it took about 2 months to complete the draft document and release that for public comment. That release included new web content, a press release, social media, all of which required interagency review. So as you can imagine, it was a lot of people working behind the scenes to create this draft strategy. So then where are we now? We released that draft strategy in December of 2023. Strategy is different from the other circular economy strategies as it is an interagency product. It's about 34 pages, which includes the glossary and endnotes, so it's not terribly long. We opened it for public comment for 60 days, which ended in early February. And the goal is to prevent loss and waste of food, increase recycling of food and other organics, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, save households and businesses money, and build a cleaner, healthier community. It has 4 main objectives, and donation is included throughout the document, and specifically under Objective 2 to prevent the waste of food, and a sub-objective to facilitate and incentivize food donations and improve access to healthy and affordable food. So what is next? The strategy received over 10,000 public comments. So as you can imagine, we are reviewing those now with our agency counterparts. We anticipate releasing the final strategy later this year. Some of the observed themes included in the comments were overproduction, date labeling, measurement, and contamination, just to name a few. And then next, I'm just providing some resources related to donation that, again, this audience may be interested in for future reference. And I wanted to note EPA's excess food opportunities map. We're anticipating an update going from hundreds of food bank locations to thousands of locations in the near future. And then the last resource I wanted to show, I can't miss an opportunity to show off our new wasted food scale. The wasted food scale ranks wasted food pathways from most to least environmentally preferable based on the life cycle and circularity assessment in our 2023 report, From Field to Bin, the Environmental Impacts of U.S. Food Waste Management Pathways. It's available in 8 languages in both simple and detailed versions, and you can find the files on our website. And that is the end of my remarks. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks so much, Lana, for those remarks. If I Terrific. I was trying to get my video on. Lana, can it seems the US went through a very detailed process to develop this strategy. Can you give us some best practice or lessons learned that you think top of mind would be helpful to other governments that are in the process of developing their own strategies?
I mean, things to consider, be patient. It is going to take longer than you think. It's not something that you can produce in a few weeks or a few months. And especially that interagency coordination took a lot of work and time. And also be open and flexible, welcome those additional perspectives as it has the potential to make the end product better.
And when you talked about be patient, I underscore that, recognizing that anything that required 3 agencies in order to develop created a need for a great deal of patience. But also, outside of the government, how do you engage the public and particularly private sector to ensure that you have a comprehensive policy that will be embraced by your community of interest?
Right. So as I mentioned, we had that public-private partner meeting that was 3 hours long, and really took the time to hear the comments and feedback as we were in the development stage. So we were still sketching out the strategy to make sure we had that early input as we were developing it. And then also just maintaining relationships, participating in events like this, and really hearing the outside external comments that our external partners are making.
Well, thanks for those comments, and I'm sure there will be questions from the audience as we go forward. I invite everyone to enter your questions into the chat for Lana. And after we hear from our other panelists, we'll come back for Q&A and then take those audience questions. So please include your questions in the chat section. And let's move now to our next speaker. Pete Pearson is the Global Initiative Lead for the Food Circularity Program at WWF, the world's leading independent conservation organization. The WWF's mission is to create a world where people and nature can thrive together. Pete specializes in food waste prevention and food circularity as part of WWF's larger food system efforts. Pete, what seems to be the biggest barriers to countries including food loss and waste in their NDCs? And what do you think needs to happen in the coming years at COP29 and COP30 to help make progress on these issues? Over to you, Pete.
Thank you so much, and really a pleasure to be here with everybody. So it's a big question. What are the barriers? I wanted to start with just, again, some context setting for why WWF and why we're involved in this issue of food systems and food loss and waste. I think when everybody sees our logo, they think nature, they think anti-poaching campaigns, they think saving the most iconic wildlife on the planet. And as a network, we span in almost 100 countries. This network is amazing. It's amazing to be part of it, and to literally anywhere I go in the world, when you land, it's like you have family and people there. And I think what's most important is, why do we work on food systems? When we look at the why, it's really one statistic that's the most telling, and it's that 70% of biodiversity loss on this planet is attributed to food and agricultural production. So it's the things that we grow, it's the farms that we have globally that are replacing some of the most critical habitat for nature. And so when you think about that being the #1 driver about biodiversity loss, That is not something that immediately comes to people's mind when they think about our mission and when they think about nature. It's the food system and it's agriculture that's driving that. When we start to think about the barriers of why countries are not putting these types of things, food system, food loss and waste, they're not putting this in NDCs because, again, they are not attributing these issues to things like biodiversity loss. And I think especially climate, right? This is a climate issue as well when we think about food loss and waste. It's a huge driver of, not only biodiversity loss and the land use change, but it takes a tremendous amount of energy, transportation, fertilizer, takes a lot to grow food. And so as we start to look at this and we start to break down the barriers for countries, we've approached it in terms of our strategy by really looking at the industrial lanes or the industrial groups that we feel could add some big value. We focused for a long time, almost 8 years, on hospitality and tourism, right? We launched an entire program called Hotel Kitchen, working with some of the largest hotel and tourism operators in the world, like big hotels like Marriott, Hilton. When we do that in food service as well, like this is, we created another set of tools basically that was derived from the hotel kitchen work, and we've used this now for the restaurant and food service. We launched a program called No Food Left Behind that focuses on farms and really getting into how do we start to actively measure and understand what's happening on farms, and how do we create more of that value and loss reduction so that we make use of what is coming off farms and maybe not even harvested. We've spent a lot of time, especially in the US, working with grocery retailers and really all over the world. Like World Wildlife Fund has you could probably bet that when you go into another office globally at WWF, there's a high likelihood that we have a relationship and a partnership with one of the top retailers in that country. And so again, it's really amazing to have that network. And then also this work that we've been doing with schools in the US. Anybody that has kids, I think, can attest to this, or grandkids or niece and nephews. Like, we've got to start a major effort to re-educate and to have the next generation and this generation understand the impacts that the food system has, not just on the environment, but also on human health and on some of the big issues that we talked about up in the front of this call, which is that not everybody has access to healthy and sustainable food and nutrition. This starts with education. And when we start re-educating the next generation, I think the future looks much brighter. And it really provides me with a lot of inspiration and hope. So that's, laying out the WWF strategy. But now when we start to look at how do we break down these barriers, it's not just about these particular swim lanes. It's also about getting some real activity happening at national level. And I wanted to provide 2 examples of this work happening in the United States that I think other countries can leverage. About 5 years ago, the states of California, Oregon, and Washington actually created, as part of their climate strategy, a program that was about food waste reduction. And that came to be known as the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment. So I think this was really telling. This was governments at state and even local level saying, hey, as part of our climate strategy, food waste reduction can play a key role in this. And they deserve some huge credit. Like those are large governments. I mean, California is like one of the largest economies in the world. And for them to make that recognition and to understand that this is both public sector and private sector that needs to be involved is a huge credit. So that kicked off and launched. And that really was a seed that helped to be incubating what we're now calling the US Food Waste Pact, which launched last year. Again, this is a recognition that we need public and private sectors working together, not just at state level, but also the state and federal coordination And it needs to have some teeth. It needs to have some real measurement, some real understanding of progress. And so that's the U.S. Food Waste Pact. The hope is that through these different kinds of examples, you start to see more governments that will put this type of work into the NDC, right? Into the nationally determined contributions for climate, that they recognize that food loss and waste and food systems work is in fact a climate issue, and that they start to work towards creating these types of programs or these types of public and private sector interactions all over the world. Now, it doesn't have to look exactly like it does in the US. There's all different flavors of how this can pop up. The one thing I wanted to leave you with too, that I think is some really innovative work that we're doing is, as countries start to move the needle, you've got to have innovation. You've got to have businesses and entrepreneurs and people that are thinking differently about food loss and waste. And I think it's really telling that as part of WWF's new impact investment platform, the first investment that we made, we chose a company in Colombia that focuses on this intersection of making more surplus edible food available to food banks and available to networks all over these countries. This particular the company that we invested in is called EatCloud, and they provide like the software as a service and the platform for linking all these different food banks together with surplus food from retailers or from food service. And so I just wanted to highlight that. I think it's really important for us to support entrepreneurs and to support these new investments, because this is not going to happen without investment, and it's not going to happen without some risk taking and companies like this all over the world. So thanks again. Really happy to take questions, and that's all for me.
Well, thanks so much for those very insightful comments. And it's great to see the work that WWF is performing in this area and the recognition that it is about both the environment as well as the people as we move forward to create a sustainable food systems transformation. Let me ask you, Pete, specifically when you were talking about the strategies of WWF, I didn't notice or note either on your slide or in your comments your direct work with households and consumer food loss and food waste. Particularly in the global north, we know that the significant portion of food loss and food waste is at the household level. While we acknowledge the work that you're doing with schools, is there any reason or what are your thoughts about reducing, if not eliminating, food waste at the household level?
Yeah, so
and how that fits into policy development, if at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously hugely important. I think it's a function of just not being able to do everything. We come to this as WWF with a really great Rolodex of private sector partnerships that have been established over 20 plus years. And so I think part of this is saying, go with what we have and go with the energy that we have. And so we really focused in on that private sector engagement to start. I think where we see some big opportunities potentially is in the impact investing and looking at companies and different solutions maybe that could be applied in the household as a way to really tackle that problem through ingenuity and through innovation. Mm-hmm. So I think we're addressing it, but in some ways we're indirectly coming at it. I think schools too. I mean, anything you do in schools, those students go home and they talk about it at home, and it starts to change things in the home as well. So I get pretty passionate and fired up about our work in schools. I think it's important.
You mentioned innovation as a solution to addressing consumer waste. I think as we think about innovation across the food system, the opportunity for a more efficient food system and food handling directly relates to our ability to reduce food loss and waste. And in both the innovations that are necessary as well as in the implementation of the other areas of your strategy, you spoke specifically about the need for investment. It would be great to hear your thoughts or the thoughts of WWF on the balance between public sector investment and what is necessary from private sector to support both the innovation as well as the action that's required to address the challenges of food loss and waste.
It's an excellent question, and I definitely have thoughts. In terms of investment, I think we've got to change the paradigm that when we invest into these types of solutions, that we're going to see Silicon Valley type of returns. I think there's an expectation from the investment community that all things have to be equal in terms of the returns you see and the types of things that you get back. Anybody that works in the world of waste knows this isn't some Silicon Valley type of return. It's got to be slower. It's got to be more patient, and it has to be willing to accept maybe a little less, like single digit types of returns, but for the greater good. A lot of waste systems and waste management systems are funded publicly through municipalities. And so I think that has to be a key consideration too. When we look at collection and landfill diversion and all the areas we want to go, you've got to recognize that those are typically public investments that have to be made. And so this blended finance of public and mixed with private sector, it just has to be set with realistic expectations. It's waste for a reason, is because we've typically not seen value in waste streams, right? And so as we try to rekindle this awakening of, hey, there is value, you've got to set expectations appropriately and be okay with that.
I so appreciate your underscoring the importance of recognizing that innovation and investment in that innovation in the food loss and waste space is not open for the most part to Silicon Valley type returns. The reality is it's not just food loss and waste. And when we talk about the food system overall, we know that the type of investment that's required from private sector requires knowing investors, because as one asset manager said recently, that you don't grow unicorns on farms. And so the idea that you will drive Silicon Valley type returns from investment in food systems transformation is a misnomer that leads us to the situation that we saw last year when we saw some 83 food and ag tech companies file bankruptcy because they'd received VC capital. And as a result, the types of returns that were anticipated were not experienced, resulting in the failure of those companies. We need private sector action, but we need knowing private sector investment that recognizes, as you know, the single digit as opposed to unicorn type returns in this space.
Yeah. I would also add one more thing too. I think,
please.
As we've done this impact investing, it has become really apparent to me that we've got to focus on women entrepreneurs and investing in women. They have a harder time. Like, I mean, it is statistically, you can prove this. They have a harder time getting some of these seed investments, Series A investments as women entrepreneurs. And we've got to do something about that. There has to be a refocusing and really a celebration and a focus on investing in women in these startups.
Yeah, and I would argue that it's women and people of color and geographies where private sector capital today does not flow. We still have here in the United States, less than 1% of all the VC capital goes to Black and Latinx founders. And so we have more coming into the space. It is going to be an imperative that we see more capital flowing into those very talented entrepreneurs, as you know. Let me move on to ask a question of you, Lana. Besides national strategies, are there other ways that countries can aim to create coordinated multi-sectoral approaches to reducing food loss and waste?
mean, other ways, I think making those appropriate connections at various levels, reaching the audience that you normally wouldn't talk with, I think are really critical in establishing those relationships. I'm working with my interagency counterparts at the government level, but if we didn't get that external input along the way, our documents and products and policies would not be as strong. We need that different perspective. We can't work alone. Certainly, we need help from other groups, other sectors to get that other perspective, because there's a lot of, when I go to events and talk with people that I normally wouldn't, sectors or people I normally wouldn't talk with, there's always something that I can learn there. So my team and myself, when we go to events, creating those networks, reaching out to sectors you normally wouldn't speak with and ask them questions about the work that you're doing, you'll normally get a reaction or perspective you hadn't thought of before. So I think establishing those networks, making sure that they're efficient, food is moving as efficiently as possible, finding those gaps. Data is extremely important to find the gaps. If the food isn't moving from one location to another, why is that happening? And be able to use data to tell a story.
And both you and Pete have now underscored the importance of data in this work. Pete, let me ask you a question. In the countries, and you said when you go around the world, you have family that is WWF. In countries that have included food loss and waste in their NDCs, what are some of the most exciting or promising changes you've seen?
Well, I think this harmonization around getting countries to adopt food donation strategies that are similar, I think is amazing. The Atlas itself helps us to re-envision what this could look like, so that when we go across the border, these imaginary lines that humans draw, like that there is continuity, like there are ways that we are doing things like food donation, food handling that are all consistent, and they should be. Like there's no difference of what should be happening across borders. So I think the sooner we can do that, the better. And this is totally within our capability to achieve quickly. We don't have to wait decades for this harmonization of food safety and food donation laws to be applied. This can happen in a 5-year period if we really wanted to. We can do anything. I also think, though, there was a question I saw in the chat of someone who stays in Botswana. How do we prevent the kind of behaviors that have led to food waste in other countries? Like, how do we stop countries from following this path as they start developing? I think it can be really simple. You have to treat food differently. It is not trash. And you have to create this idea that you separate food from the waste stream, and you recognize that food is always food for something, whether it's edible food for people, or food for a production system back into animal feed, or food for our soils. Like, it always has value as food. And the sooner developing countries separate it and they treat it differently and not as trash, that sends a fundamentally different way of thinking about food systems across the board. And you have to, marry that with education campaigns for that. So I think it's really important to have that separation.
Well, thanks for going to the chat, and that really is a great reminder to our audience to please include your questions in the chat. We'll have a couple more questions for our panelists, and then we'll go directly into answering those questions in the chat. So now's the time if you have questions to include them. But Lana, let me come back to you for a final or another question. When you were working on the U.S. strategy, were there other countries that you looked to for inspiration or ideas on how to do the U.S. national strategy?
Well, Australia was one of the first ones. Looking at other countries that had already started this process, Australia was certainly one that we referenced.
Is there a particular reason why Australia?
I think they were ahead of us, and we used their process and product as, if they can do it, we can do it too. So just inspiration and motivation too. That's something that we can work toward.
So let's go into the audience questions, and I'm going to start with you, Lana. There's a question for you from Jackie Winsek, where she asks, you mentioned overproduction as a common theme. Can you elaborate? And do we know if that is specific to certain industries, and are there already recommendations to combat overproduction? Sounds like some of this may still be in the works until the final strategy is released. How would you respond to Jackie's question, Lana?
All right. Well, when I mentioned overproduction, that's a theme of some of the comments we're receiving in response to the draft strategy. So it is common. That is a common response that we've received even before the strategy went out. If we didn't make so much food, maybe we wouldn't have so much waste, but it is a little bit more complicated. The food system is complicated, and the efficiency of how food moves through the system, I think, needs to be addressed. We're always going to have a little bit of excess. We don't want to run out at any one spot, but getting that food and product and valuable resource to move throughout the system in a really efficient way, I think can address part of that. And it is something that we'll work to address inwards in the final strategy product when we release it later this year. And we also that's an interagency issue that we'll work very closely with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to address too. But overproduction, it's not so simple. If we didn't have so much, maybe we wouldn't throw so much away, but moving it throughout the system in a very efficient way and getting that food where it needs to go. And then any scraps or organics that are left over, being able to deal with them in an efficient way too.
Well, dealing with food in a more efficient way throughout the food system, I think, is a challenge that, as we think about the transformation of the food system, is one that is not just a food waste and loss problem, but also a economics problem. And how do we ensure that we are providing the financial support that is necessary to farmers for what they produce? So these are big questions that are all interlinked.
Right. That certainly adds to the complexity of the whole system and issues that we're dealing with.
Exactly. Let's go to another question in the chat. How can HBCUs, MSIs, and universities in developing countries use similar systems to support the surrounding underserved communities? Any thoughts from either of you? How do our academic institutions get involved in supporting the underserved communities that often surround the academic institutions, whether domestically or internationally, to access the food that would otherwise be lost or wasted, to serve the food security needs of those in the communities that surround those universities? Any thoughts?
One quick one is, typically universities, they carry a mandate to have a research function. And I think it's always good to be focusing research and attention on how these types of problems are different and how they manifest themselves in different places. And that only happens when you have observation and when you have research that's being focused. So I think maintaining that. I also think they can look inward too. Like universities tend to be places where people eat and they have food operations. And so making sure your own operation within a university setting is tight, that it does donation, that it does handle food waste as a policy. So it's looking inward, but then also having the research focus.
Mm-hmm.
And we've seen some successful efforts, student-driven volunteer organizations that the universities encourage that connection between the students and the outside, the communities that the colleges or universities are located in, to be able to recover food that's produced at the university and distribute it to the nearby community. So, and we see some success with that, student-driven volunteer actions, but also to also look inward and not forget about the hunger needs of the students themselves. That is sometimes overlooked. So outside into the nearby community, but also look at the student population, because there are student hunger needs too, and make sure to distribute that food appropriately inside the campus and outside.
I very much appreciate that the last part of your answer, Lana, regarding both the inside and the outside, recognizing the challenge of food insecurity on campus as well as in the surrounding communities. So it's surprising how many universities now have opened food pantries to support their student bodies. But even more interesting are those universities that open those pantries not only to their student bodies but to the neighboring communities. So and much of that activity is led by students. And so getting students involved in both the research, as Pete noted, but also in the action that can make a difference on campus as well as in communities is a significant opportunity. Lana, there's a question specifically for you in the chat of what are the best ways to publicize the national strategy and to mobilize the country around the goals that are set in that national strategy?
I mean, once we get to that final, I mean, we're so close, working through all of those comments to finalize that strategy. We're going to use all of our partner resources and connections and networks to really get that out there, to encourage everyone to look at the objectives in there and to take action, and mobilizing all the action that the three agencies that put out that product have committed to do. So starting there, looking at our operating plans, because we've made these commitments, again, working with our interagency partners, other federal agency partners, our state and local governments, our key customers that we work with, and they can also be encouraged and use the federal, this national strategy to lay out their future work too.
So to both of you, here's a tough, and we talked about excess, but there's a question that says, with climate change affecting agricultural production, have we looked at the possibilities of a time when there may be no excess, but less food available? And are there strategies that food banks can look at to address this challenge of erratic climate effects on agricultural production and food availability?
So we've talked about this actually for several years. Jason Clay has talked about this at WWF. FAO ran a report recently that we call this climate loss. This is loss that we know is going to be attributed to climate issues. And I think the one thing that we can say is that it's going to be more and more unpredictable moving forward. And so I think COVID taught us a really amazing lesson of how we need to be structuring and thinking about our supply chains and our resiliency within the food system. We're going to see these disruptions. We know that places are going to have extreme weather that's going to impact production of food, and we need to be ready for it. The way you're ready for that is with better information systems, better transparency, better data, and also a willingness to share that information and to be willing to be transparent across industry groups. I think this is really important. And again, COVID was a great teacher of that. So let's be ready for it. Climate loss is going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Lana, would you like to add anything?
I don't think there's anything else I can add. I'm nodding the whole time. Like, yes, COVID was a great practice. These disruptions are going to happen more and more frequently, and we have to be ready. I mean, right now we're dealing with extra scraps and extra food to move around, but there will be a time that we might not have enough to distribute. So being ready, being flexible, adaptable, and learning from past events.
when we think about learning from past events, and we are talking here, Ilana, you presented the national strategy, and Pete, you specifically spoke about what's happening in the Pacific region. What are your thoughts on voluntary agreements as opposed to government-driven agreements, action that is community-led as opposed to government-led?
I mean, voluntary agreements have moved the needle a lot. I think they're hugely important, but they have to come with a real look at how you measure progress. If it's just a voluntary agreement and a pledge and, hey, we're all for reducing food waste, but there's no teeth, there's no like actual way of measuring progress and having an indicator against progress, then I think it's falling short. I mean, you have to have transparency and you have to have a certain level of measurement to be able to show progress. Else, how do we do it? Like you manage what you measure. So
you manage what you measure, and what you measure is what counts, is often the case. And when we think about what we measure is what counts, Lana, if we can, when you have the Pacific region, you have what is happening with the national work that you are performing. What is in the federal strategy? What is the role of states in the implementation of the federal strategy?
Well, we'll continue to think about that as we develop that final strategy. That's some of the key comments that we receive from state-led organizations. What is the role of states? I think in past efforts and policies and strategies that we've released, the national strategy is a model that states can adopt. If they want to create their own strategy, they can, along with similar to other federal regulation that's released. We delegate a lot of authority to the states to manage their own materials. Now, when we put out a national strategy, then they have the option to adopt that as their own strategy, and model their work after the objectives that are laid out for them. So we've done a lot of the work and the thinking and the coordination and receiving input and trying to incorporate all of that in the national strategy. So it's an easy document for them to pick up and try to lay out their own work plans, fitting into the different objectives that we've laid out and put a lot of work into already.
So we've talked a lot about government action and the action of organizations. We have a question from Dr. Chuck Barlow, who asks, how can schools and universities increase community education, engagement, and awareness about food waste and donation opportunities, especially in rural communities? And I'll expand that a little and say the beyond community education, engagement and awareness, but consumer education as well, and awareness, I think, is a big part of the change that we need in the food loss space. So what's your thought on that? How can schools and universities increase that education, engagement, and awareness? Let's go to you first, Pete.
K through 12 school meal program, 30 to 35 million meals served every single day. 100,000 schools in the school lunch program. We could institutionalize the way that every cafeteria in this country approaches school lunches, and we could integrate food waste reduction practices within a school lunch program. That's my dream, and have that be in all 50 states. When you start to do this, when you start to build this into the education system, and you change the behavior of how somebody goes to a school lunch every single day, it can be totally inspiring. And I've seen it. Like, we've seen this one act of, hey, we're gonna start composting. We're gonna start reducing food waste in the school cafeteria. those third graders, fourth graders, fifth graders, they fundamentally start to change the way they think about food and they get excited and it's contagious. I think we could have that contagious moment by looking at how we do school food and the nutrition program in school. I mean, I know school lunch program, when you talk about nutrition and what's on the tray, it gets very heated. There's a lot of debate. But I think we're at a point when politically everybody can be on board for food waste reduction within cafeterias.
And over to you, Lana, your thoughts.
I mean, schools need money and they need champions. Where we see successful efforts in school, they had that one volunteer, one parent, one teacher, one staff person that was really energized and inspired by reducing food in that particular school. And they started something. They started composting outside. They started share tables in the cafeterias. But when the school doesn't have that champion or a team of champions, we don't see that same type of success. And if the school doesn't have the funding to hire someone that's going to be dedicated to this, they're going to rely on volunteers. So I think finding each school, each organization, I mean, and this is applicable to a number of different types of organizations. You need that one champion that's going to be a big part of their job and their work moving forward. They'll inspire students, they'll set up processes, they'll do audits in the school. So finding that champion volunteer, someone that can really start and carry that effort and make sure to pass it on to someone else if they need to step back. That's where we see the success, when we have those champions out there starting these efforts. But of course, there are a lot of other changes that we could do too, but those are some of the stories where we see the most change happening. It takes one person at one location.
Change, and as Pete says, hope comes from the start of one person. One person can ignite the type of hope and change that you've both described here, particularly what we see in our schools. Let's pivot a bit. We have a question from an anonymous attendee who asks, what role does regenerative farming and innovative practices play in this conversation?
Want me to take that?
Yeah, go ahead, Pete. We'll start with you and then go over to Lana.
So regenerative farming means a lot of things to a lot of people, and the definitions around it are still being defined. But for me, when you look at the term regenerative, it denotes that you have to show a regeneration of something, right? It's actually it's a word that forces us to have to show a measured progress, right? And so in that sense, regenerative agriculture has to be constantly measured, and transparent agriculture. Else, how are you showing the regeneration of the metric that you want to see? So I think this, again, points us to this imperative around measurement and transparency within the food system. That is going to be a core function of any regenerative system. And with that, one of the key tenets that's often left out of regenerative agriculture is circularity. This idea that things need to exist within a closed loop, and that nutrients need to flow back into the food system, and it needs to be circular. So I think that's a key thing for us, is we have to start building circularity into regenerative agriculture definitions and processes. And typically it's left out. It's not always in these definitions. Regenerative focuses a lot on soil, but circularity needs to be a key piece.
Lana, any thoughts?
Oh, and this is one of those topics I'd have to refer to one of my colleagues at the Department of Agriculture. But for me, like Pete was saying, that circularity piece, wasted food is a valuable resource. We don't need to throw it away. Let's get those nutrients back into the soil to produce the food that we're growing. Let's be less impactful with our practices, and use all the resources that are available to us.
Yeah. I'll just put in a personal plug here. Food System for the Future has a project in Rwanda where we are capturing the organic food waste as feedstock for black soldier flies that will become the black soldier fly larvae will be used as a substitute for soy, reducing the cost of feed for poultry and fish production, as well as the byproduct of that production of the larvae is a frosh that can be used as an organic fertilizer. To what Pete was saying, that food can be used in the food system. It is not something to be wasted, it's something to be captured and to create both the circularity and the opportunity for more food security and nutrition security. There's another question in the chat that specifically asked about Washington, but I think we can expand this question to communities both outside Washington as well as outside the United States, because it's a question that asks about the requirements for organic collection services for business and residents. That says that food banks have been very vocal that they recognize they are providing a service to the businesses who would otherwise have to pay for the collection service of this food waste. Food banks are having to put a significant amount of resources into sorting and incurring more costs for disposing of organic materials. Any thoughts on this dynamic and the role for other partners, particularly for government, in increased sourcing that would support more value add for the separation between organic and inorganic food waste?
I mean, my immediate reaction is this is an issue. We don't want food banks to be a dumping ground. And having volunteered at a food bank and knowing that there's pallets and pallets of cucumbers and a quarter of them may be rotten, and our job was to pull them out because the food bank never wants to say no, we don't want to take your pallets and pallets and truckload of cucumbers, for example. But that is a lot of work and a lot of resources that need to be expended to get a good product that can be passed on. So I agree that that is an issue. And I think communication is the first part. If things are packaged in a way it's unavoidable. But I think that coordination between the food bank and the donor of the food, I mean, has to be really clear that they don't want to accept trash. They don't have the resources or capacity to have to sort it. So I would love to be able to encourage that communication, clear communication, and look to where it's working in other states, for example, where there is a good relationship and they're not a dumping ground for trash. And a very small percentage can be recovered, because then the cost is passed on to the food bank to then have to dispose of this product that really wasn't able to be recovered in some cases.
And our food banks do such a great job. I think you're absolutely right to identify opportunities for partnership and as well as for the businesses and consumers to do more sorting at the level of use as opposed to sending it off to the food banks, as you note. You raised the question of communication. And so there's a question in the Q&A. What is the communication strategy behind national food loss and waste plans? And how do you get that message to millions of people?
I mean, we have a team of communication specialists that's going to help with it. I'm certainly not the communication specialist, but they're going to help me every step of the way. Again, working with our partners, working with our extended network, trying to get to those sectors we normally wouldn't talk with, to expand our audience, are all strategies that we can use.
Yeah, and I think it's also a realization that we can't, like, just one team can't have all the shouldered responsibility for this, right? And in the United States, we've got to get 50 states on board with doing this, so that you have to disseminate this down and states have to prioritize this work to address food waste reduction. I think the Zero Food Waste Coalition, we've done a great job at trying to put together toolkits, state level toolkits. So we recognize there's federal work, but this is also state work. And so the state toolkit we have at the Zero Food Waste Coalition, I think, is fantastic. What happens though is, we need to get external coalitions involved in this work, because I think we're at a moment where we need to show this is a landslide of agreement. Very rarely do you have an issue where you can walk into both sides of the political spectrum and everybody is agreeing. And we have that with food loss and waste. And so the more external coalitions come together as part of something like the Zero Food Waste Coalition, the more that we show this mountain of agreement, the faster we're going to get state and then city level adoption, and then their communication teams and awareness teams on board with doing this work. And so it's all like this race to the finish line of showing inevitability that we've got to address this issue. I'm just incredibly impatient. I want to see it happen faster than we got to get this going. Let's go.
What a
It's not
great
5
place
years, not
to
20.
end our conversation, our Q&A session on just the race to the finish line to accomplishing the work that is necessary for us to address food loss and waste, while also addressing issues of access to food security and nutrition. Thank you both to you, Lana and Pete, for your participation here today. And let's turn to Doug O'Brien to close us out. Doug, over to you.
Thank you, Earthrin. This was a fascinating panel. I think a lot of great information. I want to thank all the panelists. I want to thank Pete Pearson from the World Wildlife Fund, United States, Lana Suarez from US EPA. If I had had the chance, I would ask you a question about the research that came out this past summer about the effects of food recovery for human consumption and its ongoing environmental impacts, which is, I think, great information. Valentina Huepe-Follard. And unfortunately, we were not able to be joined by Sarah Pennell from Food Bank Australia, but we hope to have her on another panel coming soon. And I, of course, want to thank our friends at the Food Policy and Law Clinic at Harvard University Law School. This ongoing collaboration, which is now in its 5th year, has been truly impactful across the globe. As Emily mentioned, tomorrow we'll be publishing an issue brief on national food waste strategies. And as Earthrin has fostered us through this conversation, and again, want to thank you, Earthrin, for really outstanding leadership, both on these issues generally and for keeping us on task. But we're reporting a national food waste strategy brief. We hope those of you will be able to pick it up, review it, and forward questions as you like to our friends at FLPC. FLPC is going to be holding additional meetings through the spring of 2024 on other key issues, such as ESG reporting on May 16th and government grants and incentives in June, again, in partnership with GFN. We'd also like to ask participants, those of you who are on this call, especially from food banks and other NGO partners and academic institutions, if you are willing, it would be helpful to send relevant contact information for policymakers in your countries. We would like to invite them to upcoming webinars. We've found that the webinars are hugely helpful to policymakers when they think through these different issues related to food donation and food loss and waste prevention, and they may find these webinars useful, and we hope that you will share that contact information as we have them join us. Again, I want to thank everyone for their attendance. I hope you'll stay tuned for future sessions. Please sign up for GFN FLPC listserv to receive the latest on the upcoming webinars. And I want to again thank all the panelists. Thank you, Earthrin, for your help once again, and all those that have been part of this webinar and asked really helpful questions. So thank you all.